Hello. Just looking up the Latin from last time, and as usual, I was totally off on what it said. So it was Quis desiderio sit pudor aut modus tam cari capitis. And that means, what restraint or limit should there be to grief for one so dear? So I think I was way off on whatever I thought that said. And also, I looked up espalsumor, or esplumior, Esplumeoir. As far as I can tell, that word is Powys, John Cowper, Powys' own invention, which is interesting, isn't it? Anyway. It was not as the devoted Codfin had warned her, if it had best not be. Let me try that again. I'm missing some commas here. It was not, as the devoted Codfin had warned her, it had best not be, till all was dark and deserted upon Glastonbury Tor, that Medbet climbed down those long ladders and made her way home to St. Michael's Inn. So great was the hubbub of voices, all relating various and contradictory versions of that evening's tragedy, and so crowded were barroom, parlors, and kitchen, that it was easy for the demented woman to slip back into her unlit room unobserved by old John Chinnock or by his wife. It was indeed Tom Chinnock, her nephew, who found her outstretched on her bed when he came long after closing time to bring her her supper. She was still alive and perfectly conscious. And purpley, I'm sure. But she had hurt her heart in some way in climbing alone down those steep ladders, and she never left her bed again. Not a word did she breathe as to her share in Barter's death. Not a sign did she make that she wanted to see her dilly darling gent, her sweet moon's marrow, again before she died. But Tommy Chinnock reported later, for the Terre Gastee stone thrower was her best friend at the last, though Sally Lou used to come up and sit by her bed of an evening, that the day before she died would happen on the 1st of March. She had asked him to go for Mr. Geard. No one, save Tommy, till his aunt was safe in the Wells Road Cemetery, knew that the woman herself had sent for the mayor, though they all knew that the mayor had gone up to her room, after having a stiff glass of ale with old John, and had stayed there for nearly half an hour. But no one at all ever learned from the mayor what passed between them. Dr. Fell had been summoned to hurry to Wirral Hill long before Mrs. Geard reached Manor House Road, and he had found Miss Crow already in full possession of her consciousness. He thanked the Germans heartily, especially the one with the flask, and then, in spite of her weak state, he took the opportunity of scolding Miss Crow very earnestly and roundly for her foolhardily behavior that day. A woman like you, he said as he carried her home in Sally Lou's taxi, ought to know better than to act like this. What you've really done, Miss Crow, is to try and commit suicide. Elizabeth was too weak to defend herself. It did strike her as ironical, however, that this doctor, who she knew was in the habit of defending the right of self-killing, and whose death by his own hand Tossie's Mr. Botter was already predicting, should lapse into this mode of speech. Dr. Fell had the wit to read what lay behind the smile she gave him. The wrong of it lies, he said, growing rather red in the face and displaying signs of peevishness at being caught by his old friend in so conventional a vein. The wrong of it lies in the example that a happy person like you, with so lucky a temperament, ought to give to us poor dogs. She was clever enough to take this chance, when she had disturbed his professional plum, of asking him point-blank how long he supposed she had to live. 5 would astonish me, he said. 3 would surprise me. From my personal experience, such as it is, I'd give you about 2. Years, Dr. Phil? Years, 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 he answered querulously. What else do you think I mean? Love affairs? She peered out of the taxi window at the Tower of St. Benignus. She thought of the thousands of times she had looked up at that solid mass of masonry that shared with St. John's and the High Tor the distinction of giving its visual character to the town of Glastonbury from all the quarters. Is that a shock to you? He said in a more kindly tone. Is that a shock to you? That's a little more kindly, yeah. I ought to have told you that, I expect. I oughtn't to have told you that, I expect. She still continued to look out at the window without replying. Miss Crow's thoughts just then were indeed those wordless thoughts of the vital principle itself, capital V, capital P. When the days of the years of its brief life have had their turn set by constituted authority. You're not upset, I hope. The simplicity of this question, addressed to her when she might easily, if it was clear, have been lying dead on Whirl Hill, tickled Miss Crow's fancy. So upset, Dr. dear, she replied, that I hereby invite you to have tea with me in Benedict Street this day 3 years hence. The 24th, isn't it? Dr. Fell corrected her. The 25th, he said. Well, will you come? And if I'm dead, you must come to my grave in the cemetery. Is that a promise, Doctor? He lifted her hand courteously to his lips. Courteously. Both of them turned after that to the dirty windows of Solly Lou's taxi, but not to the same window. She kind of reminds me of Katharine Hepburn in Golden Pond or something. The problem that arose immediately after Barter's death, that arose in both John and Mary's minds before his body was taken to the police station, was the problem of Tossie and her twins. It was Mary, as she and John lay awake in their room on the floor above, after Dr. Fell had given the stricken girl a sleeping draught, and Nancy Stickles, who had called in to spend the night with her, who first broached this startling suggestion. Why don't we take Toss and the children with us to Northwood? Toss could easily get char work, or laundry work, or something like that, to do. And I could look after the babies while she was out. Old Tom will be happy in his grave if he knows his children are back again in Norfolk. Nothing would please him more than the thought of us taking them with us on the big river. The thought of your taking them, said John. Hush! How can you? You know perfectly well, she retorted, which of us it was that he really cared for. I do know, he doggedly repeated. It was you. John, she cried indignantly, pulling her arm from under his head and sitting up in bed. You're no right to say such a thing. It's you, first and last, that Tom loved. He came to me when he was in trouble and sad, just as I went to him when I was unhappy. But in his heart of hearts, it was always you. So she spoke. But neither of them realized how that ill-fated prayer from the boat on the Wissy had been neutralized by Tom, any more than they thought of those silvery fish and those green weeds as things that the dead man would never see again. What I cannot for the life of me understand, said John, for he was too cautious and selfish to commit himself in a hurry to her plan of taking Tossie, is what motive the man had for murdering him. Old Shepherd said he'd had his eye on him for a long time, and that he suspected him of several burglaries. But what possible grudge could he have had against Tom? Why, didn't you hear what Toss was talking about in her hysterics when Fell gave her that drug? No, I can't say I did. I wasn't listening. I was talking to the policeman and to Mr. Bishop. I didn't come in until you got her quiet again. Mary stretched out her hands to the little table which was upon John's side of their bed. She stretched it out above John's face, and he caught at it with his hand and playfully, and yet not without malice, bit it sharply. What are you doing? You hurt me, she cried with asperity. He chuckled to himself on the taste of her flesh, that taste he loved so well, hung about him while she busied herself with matchbox and candle. When the little yellow flame was mounting up and her red rug and red curtains were coming by leaps and starts into view, she drew back and resumed her own place. But she balanced both her pillows between her shoulders and the head of the bed and sat straight up. "I've been meaning to tell you this ever since we came upstairs," she said, "but I keep putting it off." As she spoke, she remembered another occasion when she had kept putting it off, an agitating topic. And that was when she had had to tell him about her friendship with Tom in that boat on the Wissy. "To tell me what? Something that Toss cried in her fever? God, Mary, she might have cried out practically anything. You say what a state she was in? But let's have it. Let's hear it, the great revelation." Toss spoke as if she'd seen that tramp aiming his iron thing at you, and Tom rushing in to take the blow. John certainly had got a queer sensation as he heard this. The odd thing was, however, that while he accepted what Tossie had said without questioning it, he did not feel a rush of tender, melting gratitude to his dead friend. The truth was, he had so long played the feminine role with Barter, so long leaned upon him, and relied upon his strength, that he only felt now as if they had been in some desperate mêlée together, where Tom, as he always did, had taken the lead, and for that reason had got hurt, in fact, killed. But when it came to making Tom's tragic death a sublime act of sacrifice and a sacrifice for him, John dodged that tremendous conclusion with shamefully blinking eyelids. "But what on earth could the fellow have got against me?" said John. "Or do you suppose he meant to kill us both and ravish Tossie?" He had such a very quaint expression, at once cringing and quizzical, panicky and humorous, as he sat up in bed, his flannel pajamas with their pierrot-like black and white stripes, showing so fantastical in the candlelight, not candylight, that Mary could not suppress a smile. She thought in her heart, "How queer men are. Here he is with his best friend, his boyhood friend, dead to save him, and all he can do is to try and scare himself like a child." She sighed heavily when her smile died away. "It is in these matters of life and death," she thought, "that men and women are especially different. Women want to suck up to the last dregs every drop of the awful things that happen. They want to soak themselves in their feelings, to swim in them, to float on them, to drown in them. Whereas John is squeezing all the love he really feels for Tom into a tight little juggler's ball and throwing it from hand to hand." She turned her head towards him from its white pillows. From each side of her cold, clear forehead, the brown hair was drawn smoothly back, and she had pulled a coil of it from off the nape of her neck and allowed it to fall over her left shoulder in a long single plait. She did not know that John had thought to himself, as in his heartfelt bewilderment he had done what he had never done before in his life, put on his pajama trousers over his drawers. How queer girls are! Mary is looking in the mirror to see whether she has plaited her hair properly. I suppose she'll loosen it with her fingers over her ears, just in the same careful way, when I'm lying in my coffin as cold as poor Tom. "Give me a cigarette, will you?" was what she had apparently turned her head towards him to say. It was his turn now to fumble among the objects of the little table at his side, but they were soon, both of them, smoking in pensive peace. "What's the time, John, dearest?" He pulled out his watch from under his pillow. 3:15, he told her. "You don't think that drug stopped acting and she's awake again, do you?" John was silent, trying to catch every least sound in number 15 Northlode Street. Yeah, we're almost at the end of the Iron Bar, the penultimate chapter, and we'll be starting The Flood, which is the last chapter of this great long book. Until next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.